Welcome back to the Lost and Found podcast. Today I am joined by Steve McIntosh, who's an author, philosopher, and entrepreneur. In this conversation, we talk about where we find ourselves in the current times of postmodernity and what needs to happen to move forwards into a new time, a new era, post-postmodernity, as Steve calls it. And we take a look back at history of pre-modernity, modernity, what those times were made up of and what the evolution was of those eras. So we kind of get into the deep philosophical aspect of this and also into the spiritual, the evolution of spirituality, of the New Age movement, which Steve calls progressive spirituality, and where that wasn't quite able to meet what he imagined it would have done in the 90s and what he believes is required to actually ground it in a way that can afford us the type of transformation and lived experience that we'd want to have. I really hope you enjoy this conversation. And if you would like to find Steve, links will be in the description for him and for his YouTube channel, Developmental Philosophy. All right, that's it from me. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Steve McIntosh. All right, Steve, first of all, welcome to the Lost and Found podcast. I'm really delighted that you're here, and I'm delighted to get into the conversations around philosophy and spirituality and goodness, truth, and beauty, which was one of the things that you said was alive for you as a possible topic to discover, and it's something that's very close to my own heart. So first of all, welcome.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Before we enter into that, could you give us a little intro and a little bit of an overview of your own path, because I know it's been quite vast and diverse, and what that path has looked like to get to where you find yourself at this point in life?
Well, sure. I'm an American. I was born in Connecticut. My parents were both immigrants. My mother immigrated from the UK. She was born in Birmingham. My father from Australia. They met and married in Toronto and decided they wanted to be American citizens, so they immigrated to the United States, where I was born a few years later. And my father was a pretty staunch atheist, having been raised Catholic. He had rejected religion altogether and thought that, smart people were atheists. My mother was more agnostic, but, I was not raised in any religious tradition. But then as an adolescent, I began to awaken to a strong spiritual urge, that there was more to the universe than I had been led to believe. And I started looking for spiritual sources. The most attractive thing that was going on at the time, and I was born in 1960. So by the time I was like 13 in 1973, what I think the best way to describe it is progressive spirituality, alternative spirituality, right? The term New Age is kind of become a term of derision, right? So I don't want to use that. But in the 1970s, this rediscovery by the counterculture of all kinds of spirituality, especially the kinds of spirituality that were different from the Judeo-Christian heritage of the West, became very attractive. And there was a whole lot of luminaries, both deeply credible and some not credible, that were creating this frothy, emergent, progressive spiritual culture. And I was attracted to that. I had sort of seen myself as a counterculturalist, and this spirituality was really the most interesting part of it. A lot of it was fueled by psychedelics, which I experienced around that time. But it was much broader than that. It wasn't any particular. It wasn't just Buddhism or Hinduism or the New Thought or any of the various flavors. But it by the time that I was 17 or 18, I realized that progressive spirituality was a sort of a calling for me. And I felt like that would be my life's path. Although I was, I didn't dedicate myself to one particular path. What interested me the most was the beginning of a dialogue around the intersection of science and spirituality, right? This began, for example, in the mid-70s with the Tao of Physics, right? A book by Fritjof Capra that was influential at the time, where he argued that the leading edge of physics was beginning to discover truths that had been known to the mystics, for thousands of years, and that there was this kind of growing coalescence between those two paths. And that was extremely exciting to me. And but then I realized that if I was going to participate meaningfully in this culture, I needed some credentials, right? I needed to become more able to create culture in organizations, right? So I went to business school, I went to law school, I practiced law for a little while, I was an entrepreneur, but I realized that that my heart yearned for some kind of spiritual renaissance. That the idea that Western civilization would reclaim spirituality at a higher level, this was like deep down felt like something that was a real possibility that I had the opportunity to participate in. And so in the 1990s, by that time I had moved to Boulder, Colorado. And Boulder was one of the epicenters of the sort of second wave of progressive spirituality, right? So it emerges. I mean, you can trace it all the way back to Madame Blavatsky in the 1870s and Rudolf Steiner on the turn of the 20th century. But nevertheless, the alternative spirituality as sort of significant cultural momentum among young baby boomers emerged in the 70s. It kind of went underground a little bit in the 80s during the Reagan administration. And then it kind of burst back on the scene culturally in the 90s, whereby there was a huge, in the publishing industry, the New Age category became the largest category by far, right? In other words, it outstripped book sales of every other category. In America, there seemed like there was a New Age bookstore opening in every small town and many in the big cities. And here in Boulder, where there was a lot of cultural activity around it, it felt like a spiritual renaissance. It felt like there was this kind of emerging new focus on spirit that was eclectic, that was synchronistic, that was pluralistic, that was open and loving. And I was really excited by it. I left my job as a corporate executive to found a company dedicated to making art objects that would express the aesthetic of this emerging spiritual renaissance. And after doing business in this way for a while, around 1999, I began to see that the spiritual renaissance that was the promise of the 90s fluorescence of New Age culture was not going to deliver. That it was sort of the more interesting parts were kind of going under the waves of magical thinking and intense commercialism. And so I began to look for where this urge was leading me, this urge towards spiritual renaissance. And it was around that time that I encountered integral philosophy, especially around the evolution of consciousness and culture. Now that I look back on it, much of this philosophy, this spiritual philosophy of evolution, comes from the nexus between Pierre Teilhard de Chardin and Alfred North Whitehead. They're the kind of the two great geniuses, although we can point to others like Henri Bergson and Jean Gebser. But it was around this time that the American philosopher Ken Wilber was building on the insights of Teilhard and Whitehead, and that this integral movement, as it came to be known, was started to gain ground. And it wasn't just a Ken Wilber philosophy movement. There were a lot of other factors, like the interpretation of developmental psychology known as spiral dynamics. And this was influential. One of the major cultural outlets for this emerging culture was What is Enlightenment magazine, that was produced by the Enlightened Next organization. It was the highly it kind of was not just a journal of progressive spirituality. It was a journal that tracked the transition from magical New Age thinking to more rigorous integral thinking, and this recognition that culture was evolving and we could begin to see the steps of cultural evolution more clearly than ever before. So that led to me writing my first book, which came out in 2007, Integral Consciousness, it was called. And after a while, I realized I couldn't be a businessman anymore. I had to actually dedicate myself to writing. That was where this urge to spiritual renaissance was calling me, was to contribute to the body of thought that was emerging at the time. And I've eventually founded a think tank, co-founded a think tank that was dedicated to applying this way of seeing, this developmental, is what I call it now, a developmental way of seeing, to the problems of the world. And we started by focusing on climate change, but then we realized that kind of upstream, at least in the United States, upstream from the lack of adequate political will to combat climate change was political polarization. So we in the 2010s, I continued to write books on spirituality. I wrote a book that came out in 2015, The Presence of the Infinite, which is about spiritual experience. But it was, spirituality on one side and politics on the other, which led me to write a book about politics, developmental politics, that came out in 2020. And that led to a lot of financial support for the think tank. And we focused on, kind of building a political movement during those years. But it became evident to both me and our board of directors for our nonprofit think tank was the best way for me to contribute to the mission of the think tank, or the nonprofit organization, which is to help bring about this next step of cultural development. That the best way for me to contribute to that was not to be a nonprofit, business person, but rather to go back and write another book. So I started writing this book. I'm not quite ready to announce it yet, but I started writing it in May of 23, and just finished it like in June. I've got a publishing contract, so I've got a good publisher, and so that book's coming out next year. The pipeline of publishing is excruciatingly long, and so maybe when my book comes out next year, you could have me back on the podcast. But in terms of my personal spirituality, I am my label is panentheist, which means that I recognize transcendence as both immanent and transcendent. And, it's kind of a philosophical spirituality. There's a big article on it in Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. But I'm definitely a believer, but one who has rings of belief. Like, there's things that are core to what I know in my heart and in my mind. And then there's things which I hope are true, but I'm not sure. I can't, I want to be kind of scientific about it. And then there's a larger appreciation for spiritual paths, so of many different stripes. And so there's definitely a continuation of this spirit of spiritual pluralism, and the recognition that no human has a lock on what's spiritually true, but we can gradually grow closer to truth, which is part of what my work's about.
Wow, you said a lot of incredible things there that I want to double click on. Thank you for sharing that. You mentioned about the next step of cultural development, and in booking the podcast, you mentioned goodness, truth, and beauty. And, it seems to me that we find ourselves in this. So for the listeners, maybe we could take a brief little trip through pre-modernity, modernity, and post-modernity to kind of see where we're actually finding ourselves now, and then what this next step is in cultural development towards the postmodern. That seems like the next piece that's required.
Sure. Well, we have hundreds of thousands of years of human history. I don't know whether I can compress it in something too small, but the way I frame this is as a noosphere evolution, right? There's other ways to pronounce that. Many of the Teilhard de Chardin scholars and myself, we pronounce it as noosphere. It means the layer of history, the human phenomenon wherein humanity emerges and inaugurates a new kind of layer of evolution, right? So we have this recognition of the prebiotic evolution of the universe, right? That from the Big Bang until the emergence of life, the universe is evolving. That is, we're going from first generation stars to second generation stars. So there's a macro level of evolution, and then we're seeing the periodic table of elements getting more and more complex as more complex atoms emerge. So it's happening at the micro level, and then of course we have the emergence of life, which science still doesn't have an explanation for, but it's an amazing and beautiful thing nonetheless. And then, of course, we have of millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, billions of years, really 3.5 billion years of life evolving and complexifying and developing the biosphere, right? So we talk about the prebiotic universe as the physiosphere, then the emergence of the biosphere as a kind of second Big Bang. Then the emergence of humanity in some ways can be recognized as a third Big Bang because it's not explained either, right? Natural selection can explain a lot of biological evolution, but it can't explain the emergence of humanity at a higher kind of level, being able to take responsibility for evolution like never before. And this creates this third level, this third Big Bang, which is most often referred to as the noosphere. So the noosphere, like life, takes a long time before the Cambrian explosion occurs, right? And then with the noosphere, it takes hundreds of thousands of years of just one hand axe after another until we get a kind of a beginning of culture and the beginning of, all of a sudden, it appears in their archaeological record. So again, I don't want to get into too much detail about that, but certainly for the last 10,000 years at least, humanity's been improving its life conditions, both its physical life conditions and its cultural complexity. And this has been not a matter of natural selection, it's primarily a matter of actual selection. People are trying to make things better. So this creates a domain of evolution, which is real evolution, even though it can't be conflated with biological evolution or cosmological, physical evolution. What makes it real evolution, and there's many things, but one of the things is that it's continuing a structure of emergence, right? So the Big Bang is the first emergence, and I mentioned the periodic table of elements that charts. It's like the biological tree of life in the physiosphere, and then we have, of course, the phylogenetic tree of life. And this structure keeps building on itself, right? It has characteristics like nested Russian dolls. When a new layer of evolution emerges, it builds on, it takes up and uses the accomplishments of the previous level, but brings a new level of complexity. And so by building layer after layer, these sequences of emergence, whereby, we could try to explain it away, but the bald fact is that something more keeps coming from something less. And this is true in, of course, the noosphere, which also extends this structure of evolutionary emergence. And one of the proofs of this, even though, emergence is somewhat metaphysical, right? I mean, it happens, it's an empirical event, but the structure itself is something that science can't completely get its arms around because it's not completely physical. But philosophy is perfectly situated to do so. And one of the proofs of this ongoing structure of emergence in physiosphere, biosphere, and noosphere is that the human body is a replica of the entire structure, right? The most numerous atom in our bodies is hydrogen. And hydrogen is only created one time in the history of the universe at the birth of the Big Bang, and that's it. All the hydrogen universe is fixed. And yet it's the atom upon which our water molecules, which are the main ingredient of our bodies, are built. And of course, we also embody the table of elements, the periodic table of elements in our bones, and we're kind of using almost all of those elements. And then, of course, we have the biological level from the eukaryotes and even prokaryotes that are sort of at the base of our biological being, up through the accomplishments of all the animals and especially the mammals. Our bodies, in some ways, it perfectly exemplifies this structure of emergence, right? So the Big Bang isn't something that just happened 13.8 billion years ago. It's making a vital contribution now, holding up our bodies. And so, the ever-present origin, as it's been sometimes called, is there. But again, not only our bodies haven't changed that much, at least since the last 50,000 years, but the structure of emergence in the noosphere is also evident in our consciousness, in our minds. Right? So the language that we're using and the frames of reality that we take for granted we have our consciousness, our 21st century consciousness, as a result of these tens of thousands of years of human cultural evolution. Right? So the culture and consciousness co-evolve, at least for the most part, even though the battle begins anew at every birth. People who were born and nurtured in societies, for the most part, develop forms of consciousness that reflect this larger evolution of culture that's been going on. So again, I could go on. I think this structure of evolutionary emergence is kind of a spiritual teaching unto itself. And then there's lots of lessons. We could do a whole podcast about the deeper meanings of the structure of emergence. But when we look and ask, okay, what are these structures of emergence in cultural evolution, right? So anthropology has answers, so there's a, the hunter gatherers, and they have bands, and then they form tribes. And so, there's a rough outline of how humanity has developed the cultural complexity over time. But fast forwarding to the most recent future, I mean, the recent present, like the last 500 years, a major event in cultural evolution has occurred, which is the emergence of, the best term is modernity, right? Modernity, we can see traces of it going back to ancient Greece and, the golden age of the Chinese civilization or Islamic civilization, but it really emerges in a permanently sustainable way during the European Enlightenment, much of it which occurs in America as well. And so the modernity, it creates a kind of a hinge of history, right? There's the pre-modern and the modern. And especially after the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, it changes the world, creating like what's been called a new geological era, right? The Anthropocene. And of course, this emergence, we take for granted the fact that we're, having a podcast, right? Thousands of miles between us. But all of the benefits of modernity are not just technological. I would say that the wealth of the developed world is a huge blessing, which we take for granted. You don't have to be wealthy. If you live in a developed society, you are living on amounts of wealth that are thousands of times more than the vast majority of humanity's wealth. So modernity brings a lot of beautiful things, but of course it also brings disasters, right? It brings positives and negatives, right? The negatives, of course, are environmental degradation, nuclear proliferation, gross inequality. I mean, there is now a whole culture devoted to anti-modernism or the sort of extolling the fantasy of a pre-modern agricultural way of living where we just be simple and sustainable. And, it's a beautiful vision, but that vision itself depends on the accomplishments of modernity. And if we were to wipe away modernity somehow from history, we would regress back to a traditional, pre-modern culture before too long. So modernity is a structure of emergence in noosphere evolution. And one that is in some ways, some have called it like the Cambrian explosion in cultural evolution, because it changes the world forever. And if you look at just something simple like a population metric, humanity's population is gradually growing for, thousands and thousands of years. And then modernity occurs, the population goes like this. And so, again, that's a large topic, which I'll leave for a moment. But in the developed world, again, these structures of evolutionary, traditional, modern, just as a generalization, right? We're talking about orienting generalizations, and that in the developed world, beginning again, can be traced back, to the 19th century, but really becoming democratized in the 1960s, is a worldview that a structure of noosphere evolution that attempts to push off against modernity, to transcend modernity, to recognize that modernity is not only environmentally unsustainable, but it's also culturally unsustainable, because the higher purpose or deeper meaning or sense of transcendence that was once supplied by the religious civilizations of the world, that becomes largely discarded by modernity, right? The new sense of transcendence is upward mobility, right? To break out of poverty, to break out of oppression, to be free thinking, to become highly educated. These are all beautiful forms of transcendence in their own right. But after a while, after you and your offspring have achieved, levels of middle class comfort, once you have everything modernity has to offer, it's inevitable you look around and say, "Is this all there is?" Right? So modernity is not sustainable culturally because it doesn't have an appropriate sense of transcendence. Mm-hmm. And so this quest for transcendence begins. To reclaim it, without falling back into a pre-traditional, right? That's why progressive spirituality, as I described it earlier, is interested in every kind of spirituality except the Judeo-Christian. I mean, for the most part, right? There's some New Age Christian expressions, but they've embraced non-duality in a way that they've purged themselves of their more objectionable theistic aspects, as seen through the lens of this progressive postmodern perspective. Of course, this worldview is much more than spirituality. It includes this quest for social justice, environmentalism. There's lots of strands of this demographically significant worldview, this postmodern worldview. And I've lived through it, right? I was born kind of right before it fluoresced, but it's been fluorescing in various waves throughout my life. And in many ways, I've identified myself with this cultural worldview. But again, I had, going back to my story in 1999, when I realized that the New Age wasn't going to deliver a spiritual renaissance of any significance, I began to embrace this integral philosophy, which begins to recognize a master pattern of evolution. And I'll just go on a little bit more on this. And that is that although there are many patterns of evolution, it's not a deterministic process. There's all kinds of freedom in it. One of the patterns that we can see that is both in large scale and kind of fractally distributed at a micro scale is this idea of dialectical development. And a simplification of this evolutionary process of dialectical development is thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, right? So there's something, it's decaying or it's unsustainable, and so its opposite appears, creating tension between the two. That can sometimes lead to the decay of the whole thing. But when things are right, then the tension between the two leads to a third thing. It leads to the emergence, another emergence, and not just in the big structures of history, but in the technique of sexual reproduction is a perfect model of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So this pattern is discernible at every level of evolution, and we can see it in the emergence of these worldviews, right? So traditionalism is a thesis. In Europe, of course, it's Christianity, but there's other traditional religious civilizations. This is kind of a thesis. Modernity emerges as an antithesis to that. It rejects religious authority, and science comes to be the authority on truth, right, over scripture. But then, after World War II, at least in the United States, and I think in Britain and elsewhere, the traditional and modern become kind of fused. There's a cultural truce. What was once a dialectical separation becomes more of a unified culture, right, in the 1950s and early 1960s. And that establishment, as the countercultural referred to it as the time, kind of invited another antithesis, which is the emergence of progressive postmodernism. It defines itself in antithesis because even though there's all these different elements, what binds together progressive postmodern values is a rejection of modernity, a kind of an anti-modernism. And that shows up also as reverse patriotism and just generally being against whatever the establishment or, the old establishment of modernism and traditionalism, whatever their values were. Postmodernism is going to kind of find alternative values that are the opposite in a way. And of course, this has led to important strides, right? Progressive postmodernism has achieved many important cultural achievements, such as greater gender equality, greater respect and acceptance of LGBTQ people. There are concern for the environment. I mean, progressive postmodernism has many beautiful positives about it. But like every one of these worldviews in the past, it's also got negatives. And part of the negatives of progressive postmodernism is that it rejects the rest. It's sort of built on rejectionism. It's all grievance and no gratitude. That's one way to put it. And of course, this is healthy. It's where evolution could go. Where was the opportunity? How are we going to transcend modernity? We're going to reject modernity, right? We're going to vilify modernity. And again, that represents the first important step of this, next step along the path of cultural evolution. But as I argue at length in my books, and as my forthcoming book will explain in greater detail, the opportunity for the next step of cultural evolution is to move from antithesis to synthesis. And part of the reason that this is necessary is that among the problems of progressive postmodernism is its relative political impotency. Right? It may have all these beautiful ideas, and it may realize that the planet is so important and that we need to have equality and all of these caring values that are very beautiful, but it can't convince, it can't get a national majority for at least very long in the United States and in most other developed democracies. Because it's in antithesis, it can't win in a democratic setting. Because people can feel they're being rejected, or the culture war is a real factor, and progressive postmodernism, because of its place in history, its stance in this structure of emergence, it's not capable of creating political unity or restoring social solidarity, right? But that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing, because in some ways that existential problem of political impotency is a problem that can only be solved at the next level. right? It's a point of departure for how we can evolve further by recreating a new whole that can embrace, the best of modernity and the best of traditionalism and the best of progressive postmodernism, but yet do so in a way that the culture war isn't causing, seemingly irreconcilable tensions. So again, there's lots to say. I've been going on here about this, but let me just say that that's at least some answer to your question.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for that. That dialectical model, I relate it to this. We've got the triangle, we've got the 2 points either side, which often can create this kind of bipolar split between two opposing things that are dichotomized. And actually, I ask this question all the time: what is the third transcendent point where the two things come together to create this new birthing? And if that is postmodernity, what do you imagine that begins to look like? Maybe are there things from the past that we actually need to reclaim? You mentioned the best of pre-modernity, the best of modernity. It feels like to me there's a sense of reclamation that needs to take place where it isn't antithesis and thesis, but it is a true synthesis. But to me, one of the things that it seems as though from modernity, we kind of propositional knowing became the primary framing of how we know something through proposition, through concepts, and we lost this notion of a contact epistemology, knowing through direct contact, like who best knows laughter, the one who can explain all the mechanisms of laughter and has never laughed, or the one who laughs every day. And I guess depending on which camp you're in, you might have a different answer. For me, it's the one who experiences laughter, knows it in a way that goes beyond the proposition. And, I wonder if this postmodern piece requires this contact epistemology, which maybe would allow for this deeper sense of meaning and belonging and purpose and value, because it's no longer propositionalized, but it's actually felt and lived in the experience. But I'd love to hear your take on that.
Sure. Well, lived experience is certainly something that this emerging worldview uses as one of its foundation points. Like philosophy in general, good philosophy, that is, it builds on both reason and experience. Right? It's not as if we can just have direct experience and that's going to explain everything, because we need to reason about it and look at it, from the outside. Right? That objective view is what one of the philosophical innovations that brought about modernity in the first place, and science. Right? And science, came about through the metaphysical construct of the objective. Right. So being able to have this, what's been criticized as the view from nowhere, right? Being able to look at it as though you're outside of it, while at the same time you're really inside it and you haven't escaped it. That's part of the philosophical conundrums of the construct of objectivity, which only, can only be taken so far. But it is a metaphysical frame, objective and subjective, even though it's the error and inadequacy of that framing has been one of the few things that almost all philosophers have been able to agree upon since René Descartes. But the idea that clearly direct experience has a lot of authority to it, a lot of meaning to it, and being able to experience things directly is something that it should be in some ways our starting point. Like your example of laughter, right? What is laughter? Well, you know it when you have it. And if you've never laughed, then it's hard to say, that your objective description or understanding of it is a mere shadow of what the actual experience is. So I mean, we go farther than that. We could say, what's the most real thing in the universe? I would say that it is experience, the experience of consciousness at every level, right? At all, even the most primitive forms of life have consciousness, and according to many philosophers in this space who are panpsychists, that every organization, every form of universe organization has an interior, right? Whether that's, whether atoms, have consciousness. I don't think I think the word consciousness breaks down at that point. I'd like to save it for something more substantial. But this idea that there's an interior and that the interior goes all the way down, that the Big Bang is not just the emergence of exterior matter and energy, it's also there's also an interiority to it, which again is kind of a woolly philosophical subject. But again, passing through all of those arguments and just coming back to your point about experience being the most real thing, And what is the most real kind of experience? I would say spiritual experience that is charged with the value, the appreciation, and hopefully the expression of value, which is kind of a stodgy term, which is why I like to use the idea of the good, the true, and the beautiful. Right? These are still philosophical concepts, but they bring the idea of value more to life, in people's minds, and they also suggest practices which can make experience that results in not just the evolution of consciousness, but the growth of the soul.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned progressive spirituality, and how that started to become explosive, and throughout the 90s. What was it that you think was missing? And to me, it seems as though that was this attempt of reclamation of the actual felt experience of the spiritual experience. It seems like it was kind of a rejection of some of the, maybe almost a rejection of the old institutions, but actually trying to maybe separate the baby from the bathwater and have the felt experience. But what do you think was missing from it that didn't allow it to be what maybe at the time you thought it could have been?
Well, I think part of it was that in its attempt to transcend, it didn't adequately include. And what I mean by that is that it was it was as part of this larger progressive postmodern cultural movement, right? And we can't understand the phenomenon of progressive spirituality as it emerged as a cultural force in the 90s and up until around 2008. This was a vibrant culture, and part of the vibrancy was evidenced by the commercial activity that went with it, but much of it was non-commercial and community based. But it was trying to find spirituality, often, of course, in traditional sources like Buddhism and Hinduism, but non-Western sources that were so far away and not understood well that when they were translated to the West and celebrated and practiced within this progressive postmodern context, they became unique unto themselves, right? But Western Buddhism is not really the same, at least mostly, as the most popular kind of Buddhism in Asia is Pure Land Buddhism, which is far more theistic than it is non-dual, and yet in the West, during progressive spirituality, they kind of cherry picked the elements of Eastern spirituality in general that were the most non-dual. So non-duality has been a frame of reality that has been an important part of progressive spirituality since the beginning, but has since, right, in our time, in the 2020s, become kind of the dominant spiritual agreement within what's left of the culture of progressive spirituality. But again, I'm just touching on that. To answer your larger question, part of it was because they were rejecting modernity, or at least cherry picking. So they, that science and spirituality was interesting, but they were rejecting materialism, which I think was a good move, but also kind of cherry picking science in a way. Like, for example, quantum physics came around, and then they wanted to drive what's the right analogy? They wanted to put too much weight on the findings of quantum physics to prop up a whole bunch of spiritual beliefs about creating your own reality, right? And The Secret and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So there was, this cherry picking of science. There was this cherry picking of traditionalism, especially Eastern traditionalism, which was, romanticized because it was foreign. And it was beautiful. Again, I don't want to say that it was a complete failure. It helped to re-spiritualize Western civilization in important ways, and continues as a significant cultural faction to this day. But the reason that it didn't produce the kind of spiritual renaissance that I had longed for and hoped for was that, again, it didn't take up and use it, like this structure of evolutionary emergence that I talked about earlier. It always builds on what came before. And if it doesn't adequately build on what came before, it's not sustainable. It collapses back, right? If the cell doesn't have the right molecules, it can't live, right? If the cells aren't right, it's not going to be a healthy body. And that's because there has to be this balance of transcendence and inclusion to make the structure of emergence, permanent and able to support the weight of the next emergent layer. And so, again, progressive spirituality does it does. It's part of the larger historical movement of antithesis that I spoke of, whereby, modernity is not sustainable. We can't just, be interested in status and material. That's not going to create a fulfilling life. We're going to find it elsewhere. They've begun the process of kind of breaking the spell of modernist values. That, again, I want to take the winds that progressive spirituality has given us, because it's in some ways assembled the wisdom of the ages because of this interest in all kinds of alternative spirituality, or not just Eastern traditionalism, but shamanism, indigenous religions, right? New kinds of religion, the psychedelic spirituality. It's this eclectic mix. And one of the things about it is that it is showing us that there's more. But again, it can't. The New Age isn't going to attract the majority of the population, or at least a demographically large enough group to create the kind of solidarity building agreement about higher purpose that humanity's currently lacking. Right. Mm-hmm. So when modernity emerged, the higher purpose was get rich, right? Move out of this grinding poverty that had been humanity's condition for and religious oppression. So liberty and equality and prosperity were very important transcendent values given the life conditions in which modernity emerges, right?
The dignity of the individual.
Yeah, and those are still important values, unless we're going to include those modernist values and traditional values in a better synthesis than progressive postmodernism has been able to supply. Then we're going to be stuck in this culture war where progressive postmodernism can't get enough traction to become the leading worldview of our civilization, and yet it can't. We're kind of in the culture war, which is causing all kinds of decay and bad political outcomes and animosity. And again, some people see this as the beginning of the decline, right? But then again, if you're in the mindset of antithesis, if you're a progressive postmodernist in your cultural center of gravity, the narratives of doom are like catnip. Right, you love those, right? They're just inherently attractive, right? You just can't resist some doomsaying, right? And so doomsaying, it's not just we're experiencing some negative currents. It's like the civilization is doomed. It's just the catastrophizing is one of the cultural characteristics of this culture of antithesis, right? So again, it's not all wrong. There's certainly forces of decay, but there's also forces of growth. And it's not clear whether the forces of decay are going to completely overcome the forces of growth. And I would say this view of a cultural synthesis is one of the attractors, one of the potentials that is drawing the culture beyond the current impasse that we have with culture war. And I could say more, but I'm already kind of going on. But just to say one more thing at the end of that is what involves this larger sense of inclusion. It starts with values, right? In other words, that it's political interests or cultural interests can be very difficult to reconcile or integrate. But at the level of bedrock values, of true value is something that almost everyone can recognize as being good. And so when we drill down to what traditional values are and we tease apart all of the negatives, the same with modernity, we can see values there, and progressive postmodernity, all three of these major cultural structures, as well as cultural structures that come before, the pre-traditional, all of these steps of human history have very important values that we're now, for the first time in history, in a position to be able to synthesize, right? To integrate these values and recognize. It starts by recognizing the structure of emergence in the noosphere in the first place. Once you can begin to see it, that opens your eyes to greater sympathy. It gives you kind of a higher ground where you can say, okay, we're going to take the best of all of these and create this new cultural synthesis that appreciates each one has an important role to play, not just in the past, but in the present, because again, the battle begins anew at every birth. And ideally you want traditional values like respect for authority, loyalty, honesty. There's a whole slew of traditional values which have been in some ways rejected at worst or not appreciated at best within progressive postmodernism. The scientific values of modernity, right? Meritocracy, progress, empiricism. These are all very important values that we're going to need if we're going to build a better world. And likewise with progressive postmodernism, this caring about the marginalized, this deep concern for the environment, those are absolutely necessary achievements of cultural evolution that we're going to need to include in this larger synthesis. But again, each one of these are in some ways, you could put it in a general way, is that they're right in what they affirm and wrong in what they deny.
Wonderful. It seems like, we're in this kind of another wave of progressive spirituality, like you mentioned, with it's almost like a neo-paganism and shamanic practices. And I think one of the characteristics of that is it's largely autodidactic. So people go on their individual kind of spiritual journey and they have little flavors of different things. And I think one of the traps of that is it can lead to like cognitive biases and continuums and fluency heuristics and finding people find themselves in kind of silos and echo chambers, which can lead to some forms of self-deception. How do you think we move from that to create a true spiritual pluralism?
Well, in other words, how can we remove our errors and our biases? I don't think we can. We're humans, and those kind of come with our evolutionary psychology. And so we can be aware of them, but I don't think we can eliminate them entirely. I think that the best way to become aware of our biases is to start by becoming aware of our cultural center of gravity, right? By taking this position of outside and above, if you will, by looking and saying, well, I'm loyal. For example, someone might say, I identify as a progressive postmodernist. They wouldn't use those terms, but I'm a leftist, or I'm an environmentalist, or I'm a feminist, or what's most important to me is gay rights, or whatever the causes that resonate most within this progressive postmodern space. The beginning to look at our biases, and again, I focus on progressive postmodernism because in some ways it's the most evolved form of culture that's yet to appear on the in the timeline of human history, yet it's not evolved enough to address the challenges that we face at this time in history. So again, we've got pressure to evolve, and recognizing how these biases are in some ways preventing evolution, right? The political impetuosity that progressive postmodernism has, or on the spiritual side, the fact that since 2008, it's really much of the cultural momentum that it had in previous decades has been dissipated, that the market for alternative spirituality is significantly smaller than it was in the past, that its prominence is much less in the culture, that it's much less respected, that it's gone kind of more underground like it was in the 1980s. I think this is similar to the political problems of progressive postmodernism. It's this lack of ability to recognize that there's deep spiritual resources in the spiritual heritage of the West. That within Christianity and in Judaism and to a certain extent all the traditional religions, but the form of spirituality that's been rejected most strongly by progressive postmodernism is this idea of theism, right? This idea that it's not just no separation, it's not just all oneness, that there's actually a creative intelligence in the universe, and that this creative intelligence in some ways lives inside of us as a fractal fragment of infinity. And that this is not just intelligent, it's loving. That this is the teaching of Christianity, or the teachings of Jesus, right, which transcend Christianity. But the idea that God is loving, that's not just something that we've grown out of. That's a permanent spiritual experience. You talk about, experiential epistemology. Well, if we analyze the world body of spiritual experience, not just among mystics, but among, ordinary folks, that there, of course, is a huge body of teaching and practice and experience associated with non-duality. But there's also a gigantic amount of deeply moving, historically significant spiritual experience that could best be termed the love of God, that people experience this, and the experience of it is real. And so the theological explanation of it, that there's no separation, or that there is no loving intelligence in the universe, or somehow it just, there was codependent origination. Those theological explanations in some ways don't adequately include this gigantic body of spiritual experience upon which Western civilization has grown out of. And I think part of the synthesis is to reclaim at a higher level, again, not going back to pre-modern traditional forms of culture, but forms of culture that can recognize that these theistic religions are not all wrong.
Yeah, I grew up in a non-religious household, secular environment, and I first started listening to Wayne Dyer when I was 13, and it was about 25 years ago. Kind of went through the Nightingale Conant, ordering the cassette tapes and listening to those, and then I would actually say, even though I listened and I was spiritually curious, I would have considered myself an atheist when it came to the notion of believing in a sense of theism, certainly like a anthropomorphized being. And then about a decade ago, I had my first journey with ayahuasca. And in that one night, I went from being atheist to my head being blown open and feeling like, oh, okay, that's what God is. And that really blew me open. And, a decade on from that, the place that I've actually found myself in is the most profound, personally for me, spiritual teachings I've come across is the Sermon of the Mount and the Beatitudes.
Excellent.
Oh, and when I actually read how profound this is about the idea of transcending the conceptual self or the ego or the narrative self, when you start to look at, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, or blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted, and the meek, and even understanding what the meek means, because a lot of people think it means weak or timid, completely different etymology. I actually find that the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth have actually afforded me some of the greatest experiences of self-transcendence and just weeping and blowing me open in a way that is literally feels psychedelic. And I never imagined I'd find myself in that place where I don't know I can consider myself a Christian, because I don't necessarily believe in the things that it seems like Christianity says you have to believe to be a Christian. But if Jesus was around, if I was around at the time of Jesus, I would be following the things that he said, with or without seeing him be crucified and resurrect, just because of the actual teachings. When I've actually applied those, it's afforded me some of the most transformation I've experienced, and I found it to be, as far as actual spiritual, deeply spiritual depth that allows a true taste of transcendence in the divine. It's been some of the most profound I've experienced.
Well, it's music to my ears to hear you say that. I could say the same thing about myself. I don't identify as Christian. I've never kind of been really a member of the Christian church. And I have what we might say received spiritual sustenance from many different spiritual teachings, not all of which are completely compatible with each other. But Jesus of Nazareth had been a major factor in my own spiritual growth and my life. I think the idea of the anthropomorphized God, right, the cosmic magician, as it's sometimes called, is an artifact of traditional, immature, pre-scientific ways of thinking. A lot of it had to do with political control, like the idea of hell, or because life conditions were in traditionalism. Its role in history is to tame the lawless, warring, warlords and bring some law and stability to society, right? So we've so transitioned. I mean, here in the developed world, we have grown out of that, so we're not really in touch with those distressing life conditions. And so the idea that there may be distressing remedies, right, like trying to make people fear God, that those were useful for a particular time in history, and we've transcended those, right? And so teasing apart the dignities from the disasters from this traditional spiritual heritage, of course, involves getting rid of these anthropocentric notions of God. And yet, there are teachings there that, if we are able to, see them with spiritual eyes, I think we can again, recognizing the structure of emergence, recognizing the evolution of consciousness and culture, gives us the sympathy needed to tease apart the dignities from the disasters. And so, among the dignities there, of course, the number one dignity I'd say in history is the life and teachings of Jesus. And, he really is, in very important ways, the light of the world. But in order to reclaim that, of course, we have to, kind of it doesn't mean that we have to crush Christianity or rescue Jesus from Christianity. Again, this evolutionary process of synthesis involves saying, okay, look, this is our heritage. Western civilization didn't emerge out of Islam, for some very understandable reasons, right? Western civilization emerged out of Christianity. So there's some beauty and some truth and some goodness in Christianity that inevitably, it's like, teenagers, right? Progressive postmodernism is like the rebellious teenager of Western civilization, right? It has to break away from the family. It has to create its own identity, which are good things. But ultimately, as a teenager grows up, he realizes that his parents were not complete idiots, and that there was some wisdom that they had that he may benefit from. And again, that analogy can only be taken so far. But I think there's this recognition of, that's why I talk about it not as a propositional belief in there being God, but an experiential, achievement of feeling within our hearts the fact that we live in a universe where love is a central creative principle, and that we are called as spiritual beings to embody this love, to express this love, to live out this love. And Jesus in his life demonstrated that, I think, more clearly than anyone else. So there's so many gems waiting to be rediscovered, but that doesn't mean that we're going to become culturally Christian again, or that we need to.
Yeah, that's I really resonate, and I feel all of that. And one of the things that you mentioned was about the eyes to see, and it seems like, even when reading the Bible, honestly, yesterday I read Matthew 5-8, and I was just weeping. It just blew me open. Every time even as I say it now, I'm getting chills. But I think there is a requisite level of transformation that is required in order to, the text evolves with that, where you develop the eyes to see it in a different way that does tease apart the pointer to the depth of the spiritual transformation that can be taken, versus, like you mentioned, more of a naive or immature kind of reductionist view. And I wonder if that's even related to, I know I heard you mention spiritual lines. If at some point, maybe from modernity, even if religion itself, which, from religare to reconnect, but if that eventually became more propositionalized, so we end up with propositional religion, where when I say I believe, it's like a set of thoughts, like, do I believe in Santa, versus do I believe because I actually have felt it and know it? I actually know it.
Well, okay, so yes, this concept of lines of development, that all the world's great religions can be seen to a certain extent as lines that well, many of them, like you mentioned, the shamanism and different pre-traditional forms of spirituality, those continue to grow, but they were kind of cut off, and they've been replanted and revived within this culture of progressive spirituality, although they certainly continue in their indigenous settings. But when we recognize all the world's great religions, there's also lines of development that are rooted in this traditional stage of cultural development, but which grow up through the lines. So Christianity, it's got of course its traditional expressions, but there are many modernists, like Paul Tillich, who were theologians who were very much kind of modernists in their cultural frame. And then we have progressive postmodern Christianity, exemplified by teachers like Richard Rohr. And so it's a line of development, and it takes on the cultural character of the context of its expression. And I think that these lines will be seen as growing into this postmodern worldview, this next synthetic worldview. Will welcome various lines. It won't try to create this kind of just, kludged together, indistinguishable mass. I think that the lines have important challenges that they need to make with each other, but one of the foundations of the pluralism, which is one of the social norms that is emerging in this postmodern cultural space, not just political pluralism, but spiritual pluralism. And that involves this idea of challenge and support, right? That these lines of spirituality ideally can work together while retaining their distinctive features and their contradicting doctrines, by allowing people to see that the people who are involved in these within this postmodern culture can recognize, again, spiritual experience is a real thing. And if people are having spiritual experience, that means that line of spirituality, that path, is alive and it's delivering real spiritual nutrition, if you will. But again, spiritual experience, how do we tell that? I don't think it's just a matter of seeing how deeply somebody can meditate. The Lama says, oh, this person's developed because they can meditate to this level. No, I'd say, again, Jesus is key here. He says, by their fruits you shall know them. So if this person has had a spiritual experience, the evidence for that in any kind of social context we can talk about it is what is the good, the true, or the beautiful that has been expressed, that has come out as a fruit of the Spirit. So again, you don't have to be a Christian to recognize the fruits of the Spirit as the test of spiritual experience. William James, right, in his famous book, The Varieties of Religious Experience, kind of a secularist, he's trying as a social science, as a scientist, as a psychologist, to analyze all these different kinds of spiritual experience. And he came to the same conclusion, and that is the only way we can tell whether somebody's had a spiritual experience is whether it shows up in their life as some kind of spiritual fruit. And again, that can be conceptualized in many ways, but services of goodness, teachings of truth, expressions of beauty are all some of the core ways of understanding what spiritual fruit, what the bearing of spiritual fruit really means.
Wonderful. Steve, last kind of question or thread of thoughts. One of the things I mentioned to you in my email when I reached out is that I think there's a lot of people that think philosophy is either an ancient practice or for people that are, just in academia. And I actually really believe that, we all have a philosophical worldview, whether we know it or not. And to pay more attention to that can really afford an experience of life filled with more goodness, truth, and beauty. Because as we start to actually pay attention to that, we can begin to develop the eyes to see. So for people that are listening that may have felt like, philosophy isn't for them in some way because they don't identify as someone that or even recognizing that philosophy is something still that we can do. What might be your message to them to kind of encourage them into a more of a philosophical way of viewing life?
Sure. Well, that's an excellent question. I very much appreciate it. Because one of the things that I'm arguing in my forthcoming book, especially, is that philosophy can illuminate transcendence, right? With the word transcendence being an umbrella term that's in somewhat synonymous with spirit, right? And there are ways of understanding, at least as I argue, the three legs of the stool, if you will, of human knowledge can be understood as science, right? Philosophy and religion is a term in transition. Spirituality and religion, we could say, but this, whatever we're going to call it, I'll call it religion. Spirituality and religion and science, in some ways, are getting at different elements of the universe. And philosophy can play an important role there by bridging and separating, right? It keeps science from trying to colonize religion or vice versa. And yet it also allows for the truth claims of both to be examined in a sympathetic light that can find points of harmony. And so philosophy can illuminate transcendence, especially now, because again, much of traditional religion, especially Christianity, but many others, have been built on philosophy, right? St. Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest Christian philosophers, a theologian. But before there was a separation of science and religion, he really demonstrated how philosophy could evolve religion in important ways. But then, of course, science, much of modernity and science rejects religion altogether for evolutionarily understandable and even appropriate ways. Well, to its detriment, it makes it unsustainable. But progressive spirituality reclaims, the sacred in many important ways. But as it does so, it does it in a sense by bracketing truth. In other words, it focuses on goodness and beauty primarily, about lived experience, about what's true for you. And again, this is evolutionarily appropriate because it allows it to break out of the straitjacket of modernistic, logical positivism and all of these, supposedly empirical philosophies that were atheistic and materialistic. So it says, like, we're not going to take that on. We're going to just reject it and find spiritual, meaning elsewhere. But now that we've had this antithesis, as we move into this, we can reclaim the intellectual and the truth element of goodness, truth, and beauty in this new spiritual culture we want to create. And that's where philosophy has a very important role to play. Not just any philosophy, not just Kantian philosophy or some standard philosophy you learn in your freshman course, but this spiritual philosophy that's emerging now that I mentioned at the beginning, really coming out of Teilhard de Chardin and Whitehead, but going all the way back to Hegel in some ways, although it's certainly not strictly Hegelian. Since modernity kind of delegitimized spiritual truth claims, but certain strands of philosophy, although not mainstream, certainly not completely countercultural either, these strands of spiritual philosophy are experiencing a revival right now. I'm part of that. Developmental philosophy, as I'm framing it, is definitely a spiritual philosophy. But you don't have to be a developmentalist or recognize this structure of emergence or its spiritual teachings to appreciate how spirituality is coming to the fore again in the field of philosophy. And one of the strongest proponents of that is David Bentley Hart, who is pretty much a traditionalist, but he's got a genius level intellect, and some of his latest books completely dismantle materialism, right? So not only can, philosophy do damage to the cultural authority of spirituality and religion, it can also brush out of the way the forces that of materialism and scientism that have up until recently, like the New Atheist, Richard Dawkins, that was very culturally popular. But the vacuity and intellectual bankruptcy of a materialist reality frame is now more evident than ever. Although for many folks, especially in philosophy, they have a quasi-religious commitment to it, right? They have loyalty to it. And so it's going to take a while for professional philosophy to reclaim its spiritual footing. But that's happening outside of the academy in all kinds of vibrant ways. And that's what my work is about, is spiritual philosophy.
Beautiful. Yeah. It kind of, Neoplatonism comes to mind, this idea of philosophy and spirituality and the convergence of those, and actually how much that was integrated into Christianity and, Augustine and De Trinitate, the idea of the convergence of the Trinity into Christianity.
Sure, Neoplatonism is an important influence, just like ancient Greek philosophy or medieval philosophy and early forms of Enlightenment philosophy before philosophy became completely dedicated to materialism. Again, I mentioned Hegel, right? But there's all the German idealists, and then of course after the emergence of modernity, we have the beginnings with Henri Bergson recognizing that evolution is a spiritual process, and followed by Teilhard and Whitehead, and then we have this lineage that that you and I are talking about right now.
Wonderful. Steve, thank you so much. This has been an incredible conversation. I would love to do it again once your new book does come out. Before we finish, are there best places for people who are listening to find out more about you? I know you mentioned you have a YouTube channel. Can you tell us the name of that so people can visit that if they'd like to hear more?
Sure. The YouTube channel is Developmental Philosophy. And we are posting videos there every week. I also have a monthly Zoom group that people can sign up for. They just have to, check a box that says I'll be civil, and that I have some interest in this stuff, and I'll do my best to kind of, learn about it and come from that position. But we have about 500 people who signed up for the group, and we typically get, between 50 and 100 people show up live on the monthly calls. Second Wednesday of every month. It's a little late in the UK. It's at 5 o'clock Mountain Time. I'm in Boulder, Colorado. But we do have people from Europe and the UK tuning in, late at night. And then, of course, the presenters. Sometimes I present. Sometimes we have guest presenters. We make a video of that, including questions and answers from the audience, right, that goes into the video. So that's some of the cultural stuff we're doing. I can also mention our magazine, The Developmentalist, which has had a lot of articles. Some are political, some are spiritual. And my author website, stevemcintosh.com. So those are some places people can check out. The YouTube channel, if they're really into it, they can join the Zoom group, they can read the magazine, or they can see a collection of my work on my website.
Beautiful. Steve, thank you so much.
Thank you. Been a pleasure.